what policy changes do you recommend that would work towards undoing the racism structure in the criminal justice system? We have about 10 minutes or so left before we turn it over for questions. So, thank you very much.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that our organization, Citizens Against Recidivism, was started by my wife. And I'm saying that because to say that men who have spent time in prison are conscious of the role that families play. Particularly, we know, at least I know from studies that, any type of contact with people on the outside reduces the rate at which people return to prison. And so the organization was started because my wife, was one of those people who found it very difficult just to sit around and cry and complain, about somebody's in prison rather than, finding a way to get actively involved in doing something. So, but in thinking about policies related, and that's a pretty difficult question to answer, and I'm not sure that I actually have the answer, because part of, what we're thinking about relative to changing of policies is, what can we do to change systems of injustice? Thinking in that, and in that vein, how can we deconstruct constructions of privilege that have been established for centuries and that people are still benefiting from? What do we do to tear down systems that keep in place economic inequality? What do we do to change certain conceptualizations of populations of color that keep them being viewed as surplus populations? Surplus populations otherwise characterized as waste that has to be managed, contained, controlled via systems of social welfare and prison. How do we change these things? What do we do to change, the banking system, which of course is behind a lot of the problems not only here in the United States relative to incarceration, but worldwide. We got organizations like the International Monetary Fund, World Bank. I mean, these groups have power over so-called sovereign nations. And so the whole configuration of the world has changed today that keeps systems of oppression in place, globalization. All these things are part and parcel of the system of, criminal justice that we are sitting here talking about today. So it's very difficult, answering or even providing, a single answer relative to a particular policy. But one of the things that I do know or firmly believe in is that whatever we do, it has to relate to empowerment. That's my social welfare stuff. Empowerment, because that's what we're trying to do. People are trying to obtain power. They want to obtain the ability to have an influence on their own lives. And so, we think about social work should be, this is a word that we use very carefully, co-conspirators in that regard, co-collaborators in that regard. Now everybody's being watched by the police, so you have to be careful about the words that you use, So, but, one of the things that a friend of mine, Frederick Douglass, says is that, education makes a child unfit to be a slave. Education makes a child unfit to be a slave. And so when you think about the process of empowerment, one of the initial stages is conscious raising. Conscious raising might also be termed politicization. Conscious raising might also be termed, education, just raising the way people conceptualize their situation. Because if we're talking about social constructions, then we need to develop social constructions where we see ourselves as being in a position other than what we have been so-called placed in. And so if you want to do anything relative to the population that is in prison, we should, be heavily involved in reestablishing, higher education in prison. Everybody knows that education works. Else the people that are in this room wouldn't be in this room. It works for people that are in prison too. We should be careful about the language that we use. I'm a particular person regarding the labeling theory. And we should know the impact of the words that we use, particularly in people that we say that we're going to work with, collaborate with. We should not term them inmates, ex this, whatever, You sure you can think of the words. It's just the same thing as saying nigga, asshole, bum, all this other kind of stuff. It's the same thing. It has the same impact. We should think about, facilitating opportunities where people can participate in the governance of their own affairs. As our friend Mr. Hayden is big on, restoration of the right to vote, not only when you get out of prison, but why can't people vote while they're in prison? I mean, this would, at least facilitate, you know, some type of civic engagement, allow people to think differently about themselves. Yes, you're still a stakeholder, you know, in your own life. And so there are a lot of things that we could think about. You know, there's no one thing. You know, I remember writing a paper, we all write papers, regarding how do you address prison overcrowding. Well, you stop people from going to jail. That's one way of addressing it. So, you know, we're talking about problems with the system, or, you know, and they may not come to this. We might have to find another system. Are we willing to make that step? And so these are some things that we need to think about rather than doing patchwork, you know, piecemeal work. You know, some people are saying, let's tear it all down. Not saying that that's going to happen, but to some degree that has to be included in thinking, what can we tear down instead of, you know, make nicer. One of the questions that I ask my students at Mega is, does it make a difference the way you treat a slave, or should we abolish the system of slavery?
Amen.
Because some people are talking about, treat the slaves nice and everything will be okay. But the system still exists. So see, these, in my opinion, are some of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about policies, etc., etc., etc.
Exactly.